The streets of Liana rarely kept secrets. They were loud, colorful, and restless, brimming with honking Danfo buses, shouting traders, the aroma of roasted corn, and the endless hum of humanity. Yet, tucked between two aging shops at the edge of Balogun Market, stood a crumbling wall, stained by rain and time, overlooked by almost everyone except one boy. To Chike, that forgotten wall was more than plaster and cracks. It was his canvas, his confessional, his only way of speaking to a world that had never cared to listen. That afternoon, when the sun flared high and the air shimmered with heat, Chike's small frame leaned against the wall, a stick of chalk in his hand. He pressed the white powder against the rough surface and slowly carved 3 trembling words, "I love you." His handwriting was crooked, uneven, betraying the nervousness of a boy who had never been taught how to write neatly, but the words glowed in their raw honesty. For Chike, they weren't written for anyone specific. They were an offering, his attempt to imagine a life where love was not foreign, where his voice mattered. Chike's days were spent weaving through traffic with sachets of pure water, the nylon packs dripping cold against his arms as he shouted at drivers stuck in gridlock. Water, pure water, cold water, 20 naira. The coins he earned jingled lightly in his pocket, barely enough to buy food for his sick mother back home in their single-room shack in Mushin. Life had stripped him of luxuries, but it had not yet stolen his imagination. At night, when the neighborhood generators hummed and the air smelled of kerosene, he would sit by his mother's bedside and scribble words on scraps of paper, lyrics, quotes, little dreams of a better tomorrow. His mother, thin and coughing, often smiled weakly at his efforts. "Your words will take you farther than these streets, my son. Don't ever stop writing." Her voice was fragile, but her faith in him was firm. And so, when the pressure of the world became too much, Chike found his way back to that wall. Each phrase he wrote was a small rebellion against the silence imposed on the poor. On this particular day, fate conspired to bring another pair of eyes to that wall. Adanna Okoro, daughter of Justice Okoro, sat quietly in the back seat of her father's tinted SUV as it rolled through the bustling street. The convoy of black cars, polished and intimidating, cut through the chaos like a blade. People paused to stare, some bowing slightly, others muttering under their breath about power and wealth. But Adanna was hardly aware of them. Her gaze, restless and searching, caught sight of the scrawled words on the wall. "I love you." She blinked, surprised. It wasn't the kind of thing she expected to see in such a place. The words were crude, childish even, yet there was something hauntingly beautiful about them. They stood out against the grime of the wall, pure and bold, as though someone had poured their entire heart into that simple confession. Adanna leaned closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass, but just as quickly, she straightened her back. She knew her father's strict eyes watched her every move from the front seat. The contrast between her and the boy who had written those words was stark. Chike, barefoot, his shirt clinging to his thin frame with sweat, darted between cars with his bag of water. Adanna, draped in silk, her skin glowing under soft air conditioning, looked like she belonged to a different world entirely. Yet in that brief moment, their worlds collided not in conversation, not even in recognition, but in the silent exchange between a chalk-written confession and the curious gaze of a young woman. That night, in her palatial bedroom in Ikoyi, Adanna lay beneath a ceiling carved with gold designs, the faint hum of a chandelier filling the silence. Her bed was wide, covered in imported sheets, yet she felt a loneliness that money couldn't soften. She remembered the words she had seen, "I love you," and they lingered in her mind far longer than she expected. She had attended countless parties, heard men rehearse lines of flattery polished by wealth and entitlement, but none had moved her the way those 3 imperfect words on a dirty wall had. Her heart ached for something more authentic, something untouched by her family's obsession with prestige. She thought of the boy she had glimpsed briefly, the way he darted between cars, alive in a way the men in her father's circle never seemed to be. She wondered if the words had been meant for someone, or if they were simply an outpouring of a hidden dream. For the first time in years, she felt restless in her comfort. Rising from her bed, she wandered to her window and stared into the Liana night, where the city's restless energy pulsed beneath the stars. A truth stirred in her. Behind the glitter of her life lay emptiness, and in the rough handwriting of a poor boy, she had found something raw, something her soul craved. The next afternoon, when the sun hung lower and shadows stretched across the market, Adanna did something she had never done before. She slipped away from her attendants, leaving the safety of her father's convoy, and walked back to that street alone. The market women stared, puzzled by her elegance among them, but she ignored their whispers. Her steps slowed as she approached the wall. There it was, unchanged. Her eyes softened, her lips parted slightly, and her chest rose and fell with an emotion she couldn't name. For a long moment, she simply stood there, watching the words as though they were alive, as though they spoke directly to her. The street noise faded, the traffic disappeared in her mind, until all that remained was the wall and the boy's trembling declaration. And then, in the corner of her eye, she noticed movement. Across the street, half hidden behind a kiosk, stood Chike, his water bag slung over his shoulder, his gaze fixed on her. Their eyes met for the first time, two worlds colliding in silence, each realizing the other had been watching all along. Adanna steps closer to the wall, unaware that her life is about to change forever. Adanna had always lived in a world where everything glittered but nothing truly shined. The Okoye mansion she called home was a fortress of marble and glass, with sweeping staircases, crystal chandeliers, and manicured lawns trimmed so perfectly that not a single blade of grass dared rebel. Chauffeurs stood ready at every command, maids moved like shadows attending to details, and security guards patrolled as though guarding royalty. Yet, in the midst of all this, Adanna felt like a bird in a golden cage. She was the daughter of Justice Okoro, a man both admired and feared. His name carried weight across Liana, and beyond his judgments could elevate or destroy reputations. In the courtroom he was stern, but at home, his presence was even more suffocating. His deep voice filled every corner of the mansion, his expectations hung over every dinner table, and his authority was unquestionable. Adanna adored him as a father, but lived constantly under the shadow of his control. Her mother, Mrs. Okoro, was a different kind of presence. Elegant, always dressed in the latest Ankara styles cut with modern designs, she thrived on appearances. Every weekend was spent at social events, where she proudly introduced her daughter as a future wife to some wealthy heir or influential politician's son. For her, love was not a matter of the heart, it was a matter of position. Adanna was her crown jewel, the proof of her good upbringing, the ticket to alliances that would cement the family's legacy. But Adanna's heart resisted. The more her parents planned her life, the more she longed for something unscripted, something raw and unpolished. She craved authenticity, the kind that could not be bought with wealth or measured by prestige. And so, in secret, she returned again and again to that forgotten wall in Balogun, drawn by the simple words she had once glimpsed. "I love you." At first, it felt like madness. Why should she care about 3 words scribbled in chalk on a dirty wall in the middle of a chaotic street? But every time she saw them, she felt something stir inside her, a sense of truth, a voice unafraid to be vulnerable. It was not the practiced declarations of men in fine suits. It was not the hollow compliments whispered at cocktail parties. It was raw, unrefined, yet full of soul. So she devised ways to escape her routines. Sometimes she told the chauffeur she wanted to visit a boutique downtown, only to step out earlier and walk the remaining stretch herself. Other times, she pretended to be browsing fabrics in the market, her eyes secretly pulling her closer to the wall. The wall became her sanctuary, a silent friend that told her things her world of luxury never could. As days passed, Chike began to notice her. He had seen her car once, the dark windows shielding her face. But now she stood openly, her presence unmistakable. She would pause before the wall longer than others, her eyes lingering as though the words spoke directly to her. Chike, sweating under the Liana sun, selling his sachets of water, found his gaze drifting toward her more often than he dared admit. At first, he thought it was coincidence that she just happened to pass by. But when it happened again and again, a new rhythm began to form. Their worlds did not collide in conversation, but in stolen glances. He, barefoot and worn by hardship, would pause mid-shout, his water bag heavy on his shoulder, to catch a glimpse of her standing there, still as a statue, reading the words he had written. Adanna noticed his glances too. She saw the way his eyes, tired yet alive, flickered toward her. Unlike the men in her world, his gaze was not entitled, not demanding, it was tentative, shy, but brimming with something deeper. She found herself smiling faintly one afternoon, unable to resist the irony. A poor boy's handwriting on a dirty wall had touched her more deeply than the rehearsed speeches of rich suitors. At home, she carried that smile in secret. At dinner, while her father spoke about political appointments and her mother gushed over the upcoming gala, she barely heard a word. Her thoughts drifted back to the market, to the cracked wall, to the boy with eyes that seemed to hold storms and sunshine at once. Her diary remained untouched, for she could not write down what she was feeling. It was too new, too fragile, too daring. One Saturday afternoon, she lingered again. The market buzzed around her hawkers, shouting prices, children darting through alleys, the smell of suya sizzling in the air. Yet, she stood still, her gaze fixed on the chalk letters that had now faded slightly under rain and Sunday. She raised her hand, almost instinctively, as if to trace the words with her fingers, though she stopped just short. A soft smile touched her lips, not of amusement, but of recognition, as though she had discovered a secret meant only for her. It was in that moment of quiet reverie that she felt the sensation of being watched. Slowly, she turned her head, her heart quickening, and there, across the street, leaning half-hidden by a kiosk, stood Chike. His water bag hung limply at his side, forgotten. His eyes were fixed on her, wide and uncertain, caught between fear and fascination. For the first time, there was no wall of tinted glass, no rushing convoy, no distraction. Just a poor boy and a judge's daughter, staring at each other across a crowded Liana street, caught in a silence louder than the market's roar. Adanna's lips part as though to speak, but she freezes, realizing the boy is truly watching her. For days after their eyes first met, silence stretched between Chike and Adanna, yet it was no ordinary silence. It carried weight, anticipation, and an invisible bridge across a gulf society had declared uncrossable. Every time she appeared at the wall, Chike's heart thudded like a drum in his chest. He would steal glances, afraid to be caught staring, yet unable to stop himself. And then, one late afternoon, when the orange sun dipped low over the Liana skyline, it happened. Adanna's lips curved into a smile. It was small, tentative, almost shy, but it struck Chike like lightning. His knees nearly gave way, his breath caught in his throat. He had written those words, "I love you," without expecting anyone, let alone her, to notice. Yet here she was, smiling at him as though the words belonged to her. For the first time in his life, Chike felt visible. He stood frozen, his sachet water bag dangling uselessly at his side, his heart torn between fleeing and staying. Then, in a voice softer than the market noise around them, Adanna spoke. "Did you write it?" Her words were polished, crisp, the cadence of someone raised in private schools and foreign summer holidays. Chike blinked, certain he had misheard. "Eh? Me?" His voice cracked with disbelief. She tilted her head, her eyes never leaving his. "The words on the wall. Was it you?" Chike's tongue tangled in his mouth. He wanted to say no, to deny it, to protect himself from the ridicule that might follow. But the warmth in her gaze disarmed him. He nodded slowly. "Na me. I write am." His words came out in pidgin, unpolished but true. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause, the Danfo buses still honking, hawkers still shouting, but none of it mattered. It was just them, a poor boy and a judge's daughter, standing on opposite sides of destiny, speaking for the first time. Adanna's laughter rang softly, not mocking but delighted. "You're braver than most men I know," she said. The honesty in her voice stunned him. He scratched the back of his neck nervously. "Nah, only chalk I get. But the words day come from my chest." The cultural divide between them became clear in every sentence, her polished Queen's English brushing against his pidgin. Yet instead of creating distance, it drew them closer. Each word revealed something, her curiosity about his rawness, his awe at her refinement. The people around them noticed too. Market women raised eyebrows, whispering as they arranged baskets of peppers. A Danfo conductor smirked knowingly, elbowing his friend. "See as Oga Pikinde talk to Waterboy. Wonders shall never end." Children giggled, their voices carrying the gossip faster than the harmattan breeze. Chike wanted to sink into the earth from embarrassment, but Adanna only smiled wider. She seemed untouched by the stares, as though in that moment their world had shrunk to just the two of them. That night, lying awake on his mat, Chike replayed her words again and again. Her voice clung to him, as soothing as a lullaby, as sharp as a promise. Something within him shifted. The wall could no longer carry only one phrase. The next day, with trembling hands, he picked up his chalk and wrote again. This time he added, "You are brighter than the Sunday." When Adanna saw it, her breath caught. She lingered longer than usual, her eyes soft, her fingers brushing lightly over the chalk as though it might vanish if she wasn't careful. Chike, standing at a distance, watched her, his chest swelling with courage he had never known. The wall became their silent language. Day after day, Chike added phrases, some clumsy, some poetic, but all sincere. "You are my melody. When I see you, I forget hunger. Your smile day sweet past sugar." And each day Adanna returned, her footsteps slower, her eyes brighter, her presence emboldening him. It was a ritual of stolen minutes. She, stepping away from her father's shadowed mansion, and he, carving his dreams into chalk against crumbling stone. They didn't speak often, but they didn't need to. Their eyes, their smiles, their silence said more than words could. Yet the city never kept secrets for long. The market buzzed with speculation. Children chattered, and curious eyes began to linger. Neighbors watched with amusement, some with envy, some with contempt. Liana was a city where stories spread faster than fire, and this one about a street vendor and a judge's daughter was too juicy to stay hidden. One humid evening, as the air smelled of fried plantain and the market began to quiet, Adanna stood before the wall again, reading Chike's latest words. "Even if the world they laugh, my heart no fit lie." A smile tugged at her lips, warm and vulnerable. But as she turned, she froze. Someone was watching them. Not Chike this time, he was across the street, pretending to sell water while stealing glances, but another pair of eyes, sharp and calculating, lingered in the shadows near a stall. The figure shifted slightly, their gaze heavy with curiosity, almost suspicion. For the first time, Adanna's heart fluttered not with joy but with unease. The wall that had felt like their secret sanctuary was no longer theirs alone. Adanna realizes that someone else has begun to notice their growing connection, and secrets in Liana rarely stay safe. Liana had a way of multiplying stories. A glance could become a rumor could become gospel truth. And before long, the city itself seemed to hum with tales half true, half invented. It didn't take long for whispers to gather around the strange sight of Adanna, the judge's daughter, lingering by a crumbling wall in Balogun Market, and the poor boy whose words decorated it. The market women noticed first. Perched on wooden stools, fanning themselves while arranging baskets of tomatoes and peppers, they whispered with amusement. "CMO," one muttered, tilting her head toward Adanna's elegant frame. "Big man peekin' dey come every day to look wall. Na wetin, she dey find for here." Another woman chuckled. "Na the boy way dey sell pure water. I don't dey see the way. Him dey look am. Na love letter dem dey write for wall." Their laughter rang through the air, soft but sharp. And though Adanna pretended not to notice, the weight of their gazes followed her every step. The children picked up the gossip next. To them it was entertainment, a new story to chase after. "Auntie fine girl, Dawn come again," they sang, trailing behind her as she passed. "She dey look wall, she dey find her boyfriend." They giggled and scattered when Chike shot them a warning glance, but their voices carried far. Even Chike's friends began to question him. One evening, as they sat on overturned crates by a roadside stall, sipping sachet water, his closest companion, Kunle, leaned in. "Chike, my guy, you dey play with fire. Nah, judge daughter, you dey follow talk. You know dey fear?" Chike shifted uncomfortably. "I know dey do anything wrong. Nah, just words. She dey see em. She dey smile. That one no be crime." Kunle sighed, shaking his head. "My brother Liana no day forgive poor man when him cross line. If a go bad, nah you go suffer em, not her." Chike knew Kunle was right, yet he couldn't let go. The smile Adanna had given him had already carved itself into his soul. How could he walk away from the first person who had seen him not as a seller of water, not as a poor boy, but as someone worth noticing? In the Okoro household, questions began to surface too. Adanna's attendants, women who had shadowed her since childhood, noticed her unusual routines. She asked to stop at markets where she had never shown interest before. She returned from outings distracted, her eyes glowing with a light they couldn't explain. One brave maid whispered to her, "Madam, A beg. Wetin you dey find for that dirty street? E fit spoil your name-o. Adanna brushed her off gently, but inside, she felt the stirrings of rebellion. Why should she always be dictated to? Why couldn't she choose where her feet led her, even if it was to a wall scrawled with chalk? But the divide between their worlds grew sharper by the day. While Adanna floated through ballrooms in silk gowns and pearls, Chike sweated under the scorching sun, darting through traffic with nylon packs of water. Her nights ended with classical music echoing through marble halls. His ended with the hum of generators and his mother's coughs breaking the silence. And yet, despite the chasm between them, they both found themselves drawn back to the wall, as though it was the one place where the distance dissolved. Justice Okoro, however, was not blind. He was a man accustomed to watching people, reading gestures, and discerning truths others tried to hide. At first, it was little things. His daughter's absent-minded smiles at dinner, her sudden eagerness to leave the mansion for trivial errands, her restless silence when suitors' names were mentioned. To most, these were details too small to matter. One afternoon, as he stood by the grand staircase, his eyes caught the hesitation in her steps when she announced she was visiting the market. His brows furrowed, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned to a trusted member of his household staff, a driver who had served him loyally for years. In a low voice, he instructed, "Follow her, quietly. Watch where she goes." The driver obeyed, trailing the black SUV at a discreet distance as Adanna insisted on walking part of the way alone. He saw her pause before the wall, saw her gaze linger on the chalk words, saw her head tilt in quiet contemplation. And across the street, he saw the boy's skin darkened by the sun, shirt clinging with sweat, eyes fixed on her as though she were the only person in Liana. That evening, the driver returned to Justice Okoro with the report. He spoke carefully, knowing the weight of his words. "Sir, she has been stopping at a certain wall in Balogun. A boy writes words there. She stays to read them." Justice Okoro's jaw tightened, though he said nothing at first. He dismissed the driver with a nod and stood in silence for a long while. His daughter's strange detours were no longer a mystery, they were a danger. In his world, appearances were everything, and whispers about a judge's daughter mingling with a street vendor could grow into scandals that tarnished not only her but his legacy. Meanwhile, outside the mansion gates, the city buzzed louder with gossip. The rich chuckled behind closed doors, the poor gossiped openly in markets, and everywhere, the phrase "the judge's daughter" and "the pure water boy" began to circulate. To some, it was a fairy tale. To others, it was a scandal waiting to explode. Adanna and Chike felt the weight of these whispers pressing closer. She became more cautious in her visits, covering her head with scarves, avoiding eye contact. He tried to act busier, pretending his focus was on sales, even as his heart yearned for her presence. But the truth was already out there, carried on the city's restless tongue. Justice Okoro, now fully aware, begins quietly monitoring his daughter's every movement, his silence more dangerous than any outburst. The mansion in Ikoyi was silent, too silent, the kind of silence that stretched like a shadow before a storm. Adanna stepped lightly across the polished marble floor, her sandals clicking softly, but before she could retreat to her room, she heard his voice. "Adanna." It was not loud, but it carried weight that froze her in place. Justice Okoro stood at the far end of the grand hallway, his tall figure framed by the golden glow of the chandelier. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, pinned her where she stood. She turned slowly, her heart thudding. "Yes, Daddy?" Her voice was careful, respectful, but her hands trembled against her gown. He did not waste time. "Where have you been going?" Her lips parted, but no words came. She had prepared excuses before, half-truths about boutiques or errands, but the way he looked at her now made them useless. His silence demanded honesty, and honesty was dangerous. "You think I do not know?" he continued, his tone low but cutting. "Do you imagine Liana does not speak? Do you forget whose daughter you are?" The words echoed through the vast hall. She lowered her eyes, her throat tightening. I was only walking, Father, nothing more." "Walking?" His laugh was bitter, empty of humor. "Do not insult my intelligence. You have been seen at the market, loitering by some wall. A wall, Adanna. Do you know what people are saying? Do you understand the shame you bring upon this family with your foolish behavior? Each word was a hammer, striking the fragile glass of her heart. Adanna forced herself to meet his gaze. But I did nothing wrong. It is only a wall. Justice Okoro's expression hardened further. You are my daughter. There is no such thing as only for you. Every step you take is watched, every choice you make judged. Our name is not yours alone, it is a legacy built by discipline, sacrifice, and dignity. You will not drag it into the mud for childish fantasies. She felt crushed under the weight of his words. He wasn't just scolding her. He was reminding her of the chains she had been born into, chains of honor, of reputation, of expectations that left no room for her own desires. Then came the blow that hollowed her chest. It is time you stopped wandering like a commoner. I have already spoken to Chief Durojaye. His son, Tade, is prepared to take your hand in marriage. A union with that family will strengthen ours. That is your future, Adanna. That is your path. Her breath caught. Marriage? To a man she barely knew, a man chosen not for love but for alliances? She wanted to scream, to cry, to beg for her freedom, but she knew none of it would sway him. His mind was immovable, his will iron. Yes, father, she whispered, though the words tasted like ash. From that day on, her life became a carefully managed performance. Her schedule filled with luncheons, charity events, and banquets, where she was paraded like a jewel to be admired. Her mother fussed endlessly over gowns and appearances, pleased to see her daughter refocused. But inside, Adanna was wilting. Chike noticed her absence immediately. Each day, he lingered near the wall, hoping to see her familiar figure, but she never came. The chalk words faded under sun and rain, unrenewed, unanswered. At first, he tried to tell himself she was busy, that she would return. But as weeks dragged on, the silence gnawed at him. Had he been foolish to believe she ever truly cared? Adanna, meanwhile, sat through dinners at long tables heavy with silverware and silence. She pushed food around her plate, her smile gone, her laughter extinguished. When her mother asked her to smile for photographs, she obeyed mechanically, but the spark in her eyes had dimmed. Her rebellion was not loud, but it was steady. Silence where there should have been chatter, coldness where there should have been compliance. The mansion, once a place of beauty, began to feel like a golden prison. She would stand by her window at night, staring at the city lights, wondering if somewhere out there, he still thought of her. She longed for the simplicity of standing before a chalk-scrawled wall, of hearing the hum of the market, of feeling alive in a way no ballroom could ever provide. Justice Okoro watched her carefully, his suspicion never far. He mistook her quietness for obedience, never realizing it was the quiet of someone suffocating. He tightened his grip, thinking control would protect her, not knowing it was driving her spirit deeper into hiding. One late afternoon, after weeks of absence, fate intervened. Adanna's car slowed as it passed through Balogun. She looked out, her eyes drawn instinctively to the wall. And there, across the street, she saw him. Chike stood still, no longer hawking his water, just watching the crowd with a hollow expression. When his eyes lifted and found hers, his entire body stiffened. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the noise of Liana fading into silence. But something was different now. Her face, once glowing with secret joy, looked drawn, weary, distant. The light he had once seen in her seemed buried beneath layers of sorrow. Chike realizes she has changed. Adanna is no longer the girl who smiled at his wall, but someone trapped, unreachable, and silently crying out. From across the street, Chike watched Adanna, and his heart ached. The sparkle that once danced in her eyes was gone, replaced by a heaviness that clung to her like a shroud. She no longer lingered by the wall with joy, no longer smiled with secret wonder. Instead, she looked as though she carried an invisible weight, one too heavy for her elegant shoulders. Chike felt powerless. What could a boy like him possibly do to ease her pain? He had no riches to offer, no influence to shield her from the iron grip of her father, no way to bridge the vast gulf between their worlds. And yet, in his despair, he remembered the words his mother had whispered to him many times. "Your voice is your weapon, my son. Use it well." Those words struck him now with new force. If he could not fight with wealth or power, he would fight with the one thing no one could take from him, his words. So, instead of drowning in helplessness, Chike poured himself into writing. At night, after the long hours of hawking water under the blazing Liana sun, he would sit by his mother's bedside with a stub of pencil and scraps of discarded paper. The hum of generators, the occasional shout of neighbors, the distant music from beer parlors, all became the background to his world of thoughts. He scribbled furiously, writing about love, about freedom, about inequality, about the ache of being unseen. The words flowed like a river. He wrote about the boy who sold water but carried galaxies in his heart. He wrote about the girl who stood before a wall and taught him that beauty could exist, even in silence. His sentences were clumsy at first, but they were alive, brimming with sincerity that polished grammar could never fake. His efforts did not go unnoticed. An elderly retired teacher in the neighborhood, Mr. Adeyemi, stumbled upon Chike one evening, hunched over scraps of paper outside his home. Curious, he asked to read a few lines. By the time he finished, his eyes glistened. "My boy," he said softly, "you carry fire in your pen. Don't stop. Don't ever stop." From then on, Mr. Adeyemi became his mentor. He gave Chike old exercise books to write in, taught him how to polish his grammar, and pushed him to send his work to local newspapers. At first, Chike hesitated, certain that no editor would care about the words of a poor street vendor. But to his astonishment, within weeks, one of his short essays was published in a community paper. The article was raw, a cry against the invisible walls separating rich and poor. It spoke of how love had no class, how dignity should not be reserved for the wealthy. Readers paused when they came across it, touched by its authenticity. Adanna, sitting in the back seat of her father's car one morning, caught sight of a vendor selling newspapers by the roadside. On impulse, she bought a copy. As her eyes scanned the pages, her breath caught, there it was, his name, by Chike Obasi. Her lips parted in disbelief and then curled into a smile. She read every word, her heart swelling with pride and something deeper. Though she could not stand at the wall anymore, though she was chained by her father's expectations, here he was reaching her through ink and paper. Alone in her room that evening, she whispered his name like a secret prayer, a spark of joy breaking through her sadness. Chike, meanwhile, began to believe in himself for the first time. His words, once confined to scraps of paper, were now reaching people he would never meet. He imagined a future where he was not just the boy selling water, but a man whose pen could shape the world. The idea frightened him, but it also exhilarated him. As weeks turned into months, more of his essays were published. People began to talk about the young writer whose words carried both pain and hope. Students quoted him in discussions, pastors referenced his lines in sermons, and even local politicians noticed his voice rising from the shadows of poverty. Chike no longer felt invisible. His pen had become his weapon, his shield, his identity. The boy who once scribbled "I love you" on a crumbling wall now had the power to make an entire city pause and listen. But Liana was never a city to watch quietly. His rising influence caught the attention of people who could change his destiny. One evening, as he was packing up his mother's medications after a long day, a well-dressed man appeared at his door. His suit gleamed under the flickering bulb, and his cologne lingered in the air like wealth itself. "Are you Chike Obasi?" the man asked, his voice carrying both authority and curiosity. Chike nodded, unsure whether to be afraid or hopeful. The man smiled faintly. "I've been following your work. Your words carry weight, young man. There's a youth gathering in Victoria Island next month. Influential people will be there. Businessmen, leaders, thinkers. I want you to speak." Chike's heart skipped. Him? Speak before wealthy patrons, before people who would never have noticed him on the street? It seemed impossible. Yet the man's eyes told him it was real. With trembling hands, Chike accepted the invitation, unaware that this moment would set him on a path that would forever alter not only his life but Adanna's as well. The night of the youth gathering arrived like a storm Chike was unprepared for. He had barely slept, his mind restless with fear and excitement. When dawn broke, he borrowed a suit from Mr. Adeyemi. It was too large at the shoulders, the trousers slightly long, but it was the finest thing Chike had ever worn. He stared at his reflection in a cracked mirror, hardly recognizing himself. The boy who once scribbled on a crumbling wall now looked like someone who belonged in the rooms of power, even if his shoes, borrowed and scuffed, betrayed his truth. The event was held in a glass-walled hall in Victoria Island, a place Chike had only ever seen from afar. Chandeliers glimmered above rows of polished seats, and young men and women in designer clothes mingled, their laughter floating like music. Chike stepped in timidly, clutching the folded notes he had scribbled the night before. His palms sweated, his throat tightened. He wanted to run, to disappear into the streets he knew so well, but it was too late. When his name was called, he walked to the podium on shaking legs. For a moment, he stood frozen under the bright lights, the faces of the crowd a blur. Then he remembered his mother's words, "Your voice is your weapon." He took a deep breath, set aside his notes, and began to speak. At first, his voice wavered. "My name is Chike Obasi. I come from the streets many of you drive past every day without looking." A few chuckles rippled through the audience, but he pressed on. "I have sold water in traffic, carried loads in markets, and watched people like me disappear, invisible. But I have also learned something: our worth is not in the wealth we hold, but in the love we share." The room grew quieter. His words, though simple, carried a raw honesty that pierced through the polished air of the hall. "I know what it means to be hungry," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "But I also know what it means to smile at someone who has nothing, yet still sees you. Love is a bridge stronger than money, stronger than fear, stronger than walls built by class. If we choose it, we can build a Nigeria where no one feels invisible." The audience shifted, whispers stilled, eyes focused. The boy in the oversized suit no longer seemed small. He stood tall, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had lived every word. In the back of the hall, Adanna sat hidden beneath a shawl, her heart pounding. She had bribed her way past her attendants, desperate not to miss this moment. When she heard his voice echo through the hall, she felt tears sting her eyes. He was no longer just the boy at the wall, he was a man standing on a stage, commanding attention with nothing but truth. Pride swelled in her chest, but so did longing. She wanted to rise, to run to him, to shout to the world that his courage was hers too. But instead, she stayed hidden, her hands trembling as she clutched the shawl tighter. Chike pressed on, his words flowing like fire. "They tell us that love is weak, that wealth and power are the true weapons. But I stand before you as proof love is the strongest weapon. It can make the poor boy believe he is more than dust. It can make the rich girl realize she is more than her father's name. Love is what makes us human." A stunned silence filled the hall. Then, as if a dam had broken, the crowd erupted into applause. Young men and women leapt to their feet, cheering, clapping, whistling. Some shouted his name, others raised fists in approval. The noise was thunderous, echoing far beyond the walls of the hall. Chike's chest heaved, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had come trembling, certain his words would drown in laughter, but now he stood bathed in the roar of applause, and in that sea of faces, his eyes found hers. Adanna had pulled back her shawl slightly, just enough for him to see her. Their gazes locked across the hall, and time seemed to stop. In her eyes, he saw pride, love, and silent encouragement. In his, she saw gratitude, hope, and a promise that nothing could erase what had begun between them. They did not need to. Their bond had been confirmed, not by chalk on a wall, but by the echo of his voice in a hall filled with witnesses. When the applause finally died down, Chike stepped away from the podium, his hands shaking, his heart soaring. He had found his path. He was no longer just a boy on the streets. He was a voice, a movement, a light. Adanna slipped away quietly before the event ended. She could not risk being recognized, but her heart was on fire. Every word he had spoken felt like it had been carved for her, for them. For the first time in weeks, she felt hope return. That evening, newspapers carried headlines about the unexpected speaker who had silenced a wealthy crowd with his raw truths. Photographs of Chike in his oversized suit were splashed across pages, his words quoted with admiration. Across Liana, people debated. Who was this boy, and how had he managed to stir hearts so deeply? The papers made their way into the Okoro mansion too. Justice Okoro, seated in his study, scanned the headlines. His eyes narrowed as he read Chike's words. They were powerful, yes, but what unsettled him most was something only a father could see. Hidden between the lines, he recognized an influence, a shadow of his daughter's heart. Justice Okoro folded the paper slowly. Realization dawning his daughter's hand was in this boy's fire, and he would not let it continue unchecked. The confrontation did not begin with shouting. It began with a silence so taut the crystal on the dining table seemed to vibrate. Adanna sat straight-backed under the golden chandelier, fingers pressed to the cool linen, eyes steady. Justice Okoro's newspaper lay folded beside his plate like a verdict waiting to be pronounced. When he finally looked up, his gaze was the same one that had reduced witnesses to whispers. "You have been making choices," he said evenly, "that do not belong to you." The staff froze by the doorway. Even the air conditioning hummed carefully. Adanna swallowed, feeling the edge of fear and pushing past it. "I have been making choices that belong to me," she replied, her voice soft but anchored. Her mother's spoon clinked against china, then stilled. Justice Okoro's mouth did not move, yet the room felt smaller. "Loyalty," he said, "is not a flavor you choose on days you are hungry. It is a law. Family honor first. Always." He lifted the newspaper, tapped a paragraph, and let it fall. "Your shadow lingers inside this boy's speech." She could have denied it. She did not. "I attended," she said, "because truth has weight." His words carried it. The admission cracked something invisible. Her father's eyes hardened, but the daughter he had raised to be composed remained so. "You are courting scandal," he pressed. "You will not walk the markets like a spectacle. You will not lend your name to a street vendor's fantasies. You will remember your place." The last word thudded like a closing door. Adanna felt the old fear creep up her spine and, for the first time, told it to sit. "I will remember my values," she countered. "Dignity is not the property of wealth. I have seen more courage in a boy with chalk than in rooms dripping with chandeliers." Her mother inhaled sharply. "Adanna," she pleaded gently, "mind your tone." But the words had already leapt the table. Justice Okoro leaned forward, hands clasped, voice a measured storm. "You will not bend this family's name into a parable. You will not ruin what I built. You will prepare for the Duro Jai engagement dinner and end this theater." Heat rose to Adanna's face, not from shame but from a flame that had been waiting years for air. "I will not be arranged into someone else's life," she said, "and I will not be ashamed of seeing a human being where others see a category." The chandelier's light fractured across crystal, scattering small suns. Her mother's eyes glistened, torn between love and loyalty. "Child," she murmured, "power protects us. This city does not forgive mistakes." Adanna turned to her, gentler. "It also does not forgive emptiness." The household trembled with the aftershocks of words no one had rehearsed. Servants retreated. Doors softened their own closing. In her room, Adanna stood before the mirror and watched a familiar stranger the girl taught to curtsy, to expectations give way to a woman unafraid of the cost of truth. She thought of the wall, now weathered, and of Chike's voice lifting a hall of glass until it rang like a bell. Pride mingled with longing. Fear braided itself with resolve. If her life was to be a performance, she would at least choose the script. Across town, under the stubborn heat of an evening generator, Chike sat with guilt heavy in his chest. He had seen the papers how the city had gathered his words and turned them into a bonfire. He imagined the fire licking at Adanna's doorstep, imagined the voices around her sharpening into knives, imagined her father's iron posture. "Maybe Nami Kozam," he confessed to Mr. Adeyemi, who listened with brows knit. "Maybe I suppose calm down, Wakakomot from Liana. Make her life easy small." The old teacher blew out a thoughtful breath. "You cannot protect someone by erasing yourself," he said. "If leaving is truth, leave. If leaving is fear, stay." Chike stared at his hands, the same hands that had carried water through traffic and now carried sentences into rooms he had never dreamed of entering. "What if my presence is a burden?" he asked. "What if my success is a match in a crowded market?" Mr. Adeyemi's eyes softened. "Then learn to hold the fire. Do not throw it away." Adanna, meanwhile, found courage in the most unexpected place. Quiet. She stopped performing at dinners. She let silence answer where obedience used to. She dressed beautifully but refused to sparkle on command. In the mornings, she read the papers privately and traced the shape of Chike's name as if it were a shoreline. Each essay he published felt like oxygen. She learned his cadence, the way he folded pain into hope and made it sound like a door opening. When she closed her eyes at night, Liana became a map not of neighborhoods, but of two pulsing lights drawing closer. Unable to bear the distance, she sought him again. No convoy, no attendants, just a scarf, sunglasses, and the memory of a path. The market received her like a rumor reborn. She found the wall, its chalk softened by rain, and then she found him, standing not with a water bag but with a notebook tucked under his arm. Their eyes met, and the ache became a language. "I'm sorry," he began, voice low. "If my words—" She shook her head, stepping closer, the crowd dissolving. "Your words gave me mine," she said. "Don't ever apologize for light." They walked without plan, letting the city decide their corners. He told her about the invitation, the trembling, the moment the hall went quiet. She told him about the dining table, about refusing to bend, and the way truth had scorched the wallpaper. They laughed softly at the madness of it all, a boy and a judge's daughter carving a road in a city that preferred ready-made highways. Chike confessed his thought of leaving Liana. Adanna's grip tightened around his fingers. "If you leave," she said, "leave because the horizon calls you, not because fear pushes." When they parted, it was with the solidity of something newly named. He returned to his mother's room and wrote until dawn, each line a rope tossed toward a future he could almost touch. She returned to Ikoyi with wind in her lungs, a woman carrying an ember beneath silk. The mansion noticed staff exchanged glances. Her mother studied her with worried tenderness, and Justice Okoro watched from a balcony, a general measuring a field he had never lost. The field, however, had changed. That weekend, the Okoros hosted a set of flasks, gala strings, glitter, chandeliers like captured constellations. Power shook hands with power while photographers drank the light. Adanna made her entrance serene, eyes calm, steps unhurried. She greeted dignitaries, listened politely, and then, at a moment almost too small to register, slipped from the swirl of gold and perfume into the evening air. From the balcony above, Justice Okoro followed the absence like a scent and realized his daughter was missing from her own gala. The mansion adjusted itself around Adanna like a fist closing. After the gala, the rules multiplied without announcement, cars she could not take without permission, rooms she could not enter without a reason, days arranged like chessboards where every move had already been chosen. Her phone was managed, her outings coordinated, and the staff, once warm and chatty, now watched her with the polite stiffness of people who understood new orders. She felt it in the corridors, in the timing of doors that opened slower than before, in the way the garden gates creaked but did not yield. Freedom had narrowed to a hallway between breakfast and dinner, yet the world beyond those gates kept growing, and at its edge stood Chike. His voice began to echo through spaces that had never been designed for boys like him: youth centers in Agag, auditoriums in Surulere, streaming clips shared across campuses in Nsukka and Ibadan. The electricity might blink, the microphones might crackle, but his sentences found their way, walking past outages and traffic and skepticism. He spoke of dignity without permission slips. He spoke of love as a civic duty. He spoke of hunger without pity, of hope without pretense. Editors noticed. His essays, first neighborhood famous, leapt into national dailies. Headings bearing his name folded into breakfast conversations, radio call-ins, WhatsApp debates that boiled long after midnight. Universities invited him to read. NGOs asked him to consult. Brands sniffed at him like cautious cats, wondering how to borrow his authenticity without burning their fingers. He declined the hollow offers and chose rooms where his words would not be turned into slogans. Each choice sharpened the outline of a man emerging from the boy who once sold water between buses. In Ikoyi, Adanna followed every step from inside her curated captivity. If a driver tuned the radio, she recognized Chike's cadence before the host announced him. If a maid left a newspaper on a side table, she found it and devoured his column quickly, heart racing as though she were stealing treasure. She mapped his journeys on her mind, tracing the arc from wall to page to stage, and each new milestone was both balm and bruise. Pride flared, distance deepened. She moved through the mansion like a beautiful rumor about to be disproved. The longing between them did not shrink with separation. It calcified, became architecture. It lived in the space between chandelier light and the shadowed underside of tables, in the pause between her father's instructions and her mother's bright interjections. At night, she would stand on her balcony, the city flickering like a vast constellation of small stubborns, and think of a boy writing in generator hum, his lamp flickering, his jaw set against fatigue. The sky above them was the same sky, that felt like both comfort and cruelty. Then came the offer. A foundation abroad, its board peppered with scholars and philanthropists, announced an inaugural fellowship for voices reshaping African civic imagination. Chike's name rose to the top of the list like a buoy. The fellowship promised a year of study, mentorship, a stipend that would stabilize his household, and a network that could turn his pen into a lighthouse. The email glowed on the borrowed laptop like a door flung open onto morning. His mother, thinner now but steady with faith, gripped his hands as he told her. "This is harvest," she said, eyes filling. "Go and learn. Bring back a bigger table." In her smile he saw the life she had postponed for him. In her voice, the permission he did not know he had been waiting for. Mr. Adeyemi clapped his shoulder and laughed softly. "You asked how to hold fire," he said. "Sometimes you carry it across oceans." News of the fellowship spread with the speed of good gossip. In salons and markets, in staff rooms and student hostels, people debated the same question. Would he go? In Ikoyi, the question reached Adanna like a draft under a locked door. She overheard it, two society women trading headlines over tea, a radio host marveling at the pure water boy turned public philosopher, a stylist murmuring to a makeup artist about London or New York, "I'm not sure." The details were blurry. The message was sharp. He might leave. Betrayal was not the right word, but it pricked her anyway. She told herself he owed her nothing, no promise had been spoken, no plan carved. Still, her chest tightened with the old ache of a window you cannot open. Did ambition require an ocean? Did love count in flight hours? She imagined him in winter coats and seminar rooms, his metaphors trading Liana heat for foreign skylines, and she felt both proud and pierced. She wanted to bless the voyage and forbid it in the same breath. Chike hesitated where no one could see. The fellowship brochure lay beside his mother's inhaler, two futures sharing a small table. He pictured classrooms, libraries, mentors who had written the books he devoured by candlelight. He also pictured the wall, the market, the balcony, where he knew she sometimes stood watching a city that would not loosen. Desire split in him, one path a long runway, the other a difficult garden with a familiar gate. On nights when the generator stuttered, he could hear both futures breathing. He met Adanna once in those days, a brief crossing orchestrated by luck and bravery. No plans, no messages, just two people turning a corner at the same time. The world thinned around them. "They want me abroad," he said, the words heavier than they sounded. She nodded too quickly. "Congratulations," she managed, and the syllables tasted like salt. They spoke like diplomats, negotiating weather, careful and doomed. When they parted, the air felt bruised where they had been standing. Departure day arrived wearing harmattan light. The airport churned with plastic-wrapped suitcases and sleep-flattened wigs, with hugs that tried to fix time and jokes that tried to delay it. Chike moved through it holding a passport like someone else's photograph. Mr. Adeyemi's handshake contained a blessing and a warning. Return deeper, not just louder. His mother adjusted his collar as if he were still the boy with skinned knees. "Go," she whispered. "But remember your name." At the glass doors that divided here from elsewhere, he paused. The announcements droned. The tiled floor gleamed with departure. He could feel the plane already, a silver sentence pulling him toward commas he had dreamed of. He closed his eyes and saw a wall in Balogun, a balcony in Ikoyi. A city that never apologized for complexity. He opened them and looked back through the window, toward a skyline he had learned by heart. Hand on his boarding pass, Chike glanced over his shoulder at Liana and wondered was stepping forward the truest way to stay. Years later, Liana received him like a city that remembered a rumor and found it had become a legend. Chike stepped off the plane wearing a tailored navy suit, a watch that gleamed like a quiet promise, and a calm forged by years of study, stages, and solitude. He had left as a boy clutching a borrowed notebook. He returned as a man whose essays were taught on campuses and quoted in boardrooms, whose talks filled halls from Accra to Abuja, London to Kigali. The airport cameras flashed. An usher from the event company whisked him into a black SUV, the leather cool against his palm, the warned skyline rising to greet him with glass and ambition. His calendar overflowed. Hotels sent handwritten welcome cards, magazines requested covers, and brands angled for association with a voice that could tilt public conversation without shouting. He checked into a penthouse overlooking the lagoon, floor-to-ceiling windows catching dawn as if it were something you could hold. Private lounges replaced roadside stalls, airport lounges replaced bus stops, but in quiet hours, he still heard the rhythm of traffic where his sentences first learned to walk. By afternoon, his team had mapped interviews, radio stops, a keynote at a leadership forum on Victoria Island. Cars idled, stylists fussed, phones chimed. Yet when the city tilted toward evening, he asked the driver for a detour. The request surprised even him. "Balogun," he said softly. "I want to see a wall." The chauffeur blinked, then nodded, weaving through streets where the old city beat beneath new polish. The market greeted him with the same unfiltered chorus. Hawkers bargaining, generators humming, a grill snapping oil into the air. And there it was, his old confidant faded, cracked, stubbornly standing. Time had rubbed the chalk away, but not the memory. Chike laid a palm against the rough surface, feeling an ache that was not only nostalgia. Here, a simple sentence had rearranged his fate. Here, a girl in silk had smiled at a boy in dust and made belief feel practical. He closed his eyes, hearing again the laughter of children, the whisper of gossip, the private thunder of a heart discovering its own volume. When he opened them, the wall was still only a wall, yet it glowed with everything it had once held. Elsewhere in the city, Adanna's name rolled through conference corridors with effortless authority. She had become the kind of lawyer people described with metaphors, blade, lighthouse, bridge, depending on whether they felt threatened or saved by her clarity. She rarely entered court. Strategy was her arena. She advised boards, negotiated cross-border deals, led policy roundtables where men twice her age took notes. Her wardrobe had evolved into architectural silhouettes, clean lines, quiet fabrics, colors that spoke softly and carried steel. In photographs, she looked composed. In reflective surfaces, she sometimes searched for the girl who had once paused before a chalk confession and felt the world tilt. They met without orchestration, as though the city arranged coincidences when it sensed unfinished sentences. It was at a gallery opening in Oniru, all white walls and murmured opinions, champagne winking in slender glasses. A curator praised emergent African futurisms, a DJ braided highlife into soft electronic pulses. Chike arrived late, flanked by organizers. Adanna arrived early, flanked by her firm's partners. Their circles orbited, then crossed. A pause opened where sound should have been. He saw the architecture of her poise, the steadiness of eyes that had learned to read power and ignore it. She saw the ease in his shoulders, the confidence that did not ask permission. "Adanna," he said, and the syllables clicked into a place inside him that had never been rented out. "Chike," she answered, and a smile touched the corner of her mouth like memory knocking at a familiar gate. For a breath, they were back at the wall, the market noise replaced by gallery hush, chalk traded for curated light. Small talk arrived as a servant does, useful and insufficient. "How long are you in town?" "Too brief. I read your last column. I heard your panel last month. Congratulations, thank you." Their voices were careful, but the air between them wasn't. He noticed the new angles of her confidence. She noticed the softened edges of his intensity. He told her the wall still stood. She laughed quietly, then swallowed it, as if laughter could be overheard. "Some things refuse extinction," she said. "Some things evolve," he replied, meaning the same sentence and many others. Around them, people drifted past, assuming two successful acquaintances exchanging professional warmth. Nobody saw the past rising like heat between stones. There was, however, a detail the room did not miss. The man at Adanna's side earlier, introduced by a partner with the kind of pride that hinted at deals nesting inside of families. Gideon Durojaye, polished, tall, decisive, led a logistics empire that moved goods across West Africa and influence across rooms. When he reappeared beside her, conversation shifted around his presence the way a river shifts around a rock. "We've been looking for you," he said to Adanna with practiced intimacy, then extended a hand to Chike. "I've read you." His smile did not reach his eyes. Powerful rhetoric. Rhetoric is a kindness when truth will do. Chike answered pleasantly, and Gideon's mouth twitched, uncertain whether to be amused. Adanna watched them with the composure of someone who measures fault lines before anyone else hears the first crack. Gideon touched the small of her back, a gesture meant to claim without appearing to, and guided her toward a patron eager to talk shipping corridors. Chike stepped aside, accepting introductions, smiling for photos, answering questions about youth and governance, while some stubborn part of him remained at a wall with fading chalk. Later, on a terrace washed in warm light, sea air combed through conversation. Liana glittered like a necklace that knew its value. Adanna stood at the railing, glass untouched, the city's wind lifting a strand of hair in quiet rebellion. Chike joined her a polite distance away. "You look complete," he said, and meant it. "You look returned," she replied, and meant that too. Silence settled, not awkward, simply full. "I'm engaged," she added, eyes on the water. "I guessed," he said softly. "I'm happy you're steady." The word broke a little in the ruz, in his mouth. They did not rehearse regret. They did not name what might have been. They talked instead about the future as if it were a neutral country initiatives, youth hubs, scholarships, the possibility of a reading room in Balogun, where the wall could keep watch over books and light. When she laughed unguarded, sudden it startled them both. For a moment, the city bent closer. Inside, cameras flared again as donors posed near a sculpture of welded spoons and dreams. Gideon stepped onto the terrace, his stride measured, his face composed for public charm. He called Adanna's name, then stilled. The angle of her body, the softness in her eyes, the way she tilted toward Chike as though listening with her whole history, none of it was dramatic. All of it was unmistakable. Gideon's smile held, but his gaze sharpened. He had seen the way she looked at Chike, and the room, suddenly, had a new temperature. The days that followed the gallery opening felt like walking a narrow bridge between two cities. Adanna moved through her routines with flawless grace, but inside, every step rang with questions. In one direction stood Gideon, a life engineered for stability, legitimacy, and effortless access. In the other stood Chike, a life composed of bravery, tenderness, and a memory of chalk on a crumbling wall that had taught her to breathe. Sleep thinned. Dawn arrived too quickly. Liana traffic hummed like a metronome to indecision. Gideon's world was a choreography of certainty. Drivers appeared before she asked, tables opened at restaurants booked for weeks, meetings turned compliant under his measured baritone. "Legacy is a responsibility," he told her as they toured a new logistics hub, cranes bending like obedient giants. "Together we can pull levers that matter." Her parents adored the sentence. Mrs. Okoro beamed at the efficiency. Justice Okoro nodded with the relief of a general whose flanks were secured. Power, packaged in manners, had come to ask for their daughter. Chike's world thrummed with another music. His calendar was crowded, but his presence remained uncluttered. He visited schools in Ajegunle and Yaba, reading paragraphs that unlatched windows in young minds. He sat with community organizers in Ajege, listening more than he spoke. When reporters pushed for gossip, he shifted the spotlight to scholarships and libraries. He did not promise invincibility, he promised attention. With him, Adanna felt the quiet permission to exist without costume. Pressure gathered like storm clouds over Ikoyi. Justice Okoro summoned Adanna to his study, the air smelling of leather and ambition. "You stand at a gate," he said, eyes steady. "Behind you is childhood, before you is legacy. This family has paid in discipline for doors you may walk through. Do not waste the currency." She met his gaze, unflinching. "What is legacy without joy?" she asked. "Is a house successful if every window is shut?" His jaw tightened, the briefest tremor of surprise at her audacity. "Joy," he replied, "is safest inside structure." Friends became a chorus that could not find a single key. Some urged caution, some romance, some practical arithmetic. "Gideon is a continent," one said. "Why choose a peninsula?" Another whispered, half envious, half sincere, "Chike is the only person who speaks like Liana is human." Social media weaponized the dilemma, turning speculation into sport. Memes multiplied. Think pieces argued about class and love. Adanna learned to mute her phone and listen to her breath. She met Chike beneath evening light where the market thinned and generators blinked awake. The wall, worn and watchful, received them without ceremony. "Everyone has opinions," she said, a tired smile touching the edges of her mouth. "I carry them like weights in my ankles." He shook his head. "You don't owe anyone choreography," he answered. "Not even me." She studied him, grateful for the line he would not cross. "You won't fight?" she asked, half testing, half hoping. "I'll witness," he said. "I'll tell the truth about what I feel. But I won't beg. Love that needs begging is only hunger." They stood in silence, letting the city speak. A hawker sang prices like prayer. A child chased a plastic bag that refused capture. Smoke from a suya stand braided with wind. "Do you remember the first time you saw the words?" he asked softly. "I remember the feeling," she replied. "Like finding a door where there should have been a wall." He nodded, eyes on the cracks that mapped their origin. "Whatever you choose, keep that door," he said. "Don't trade it for better wallpaper." Adanna laughed, a small, relieved sound. "You always turn the knife kindly," she teased. He smiled. "I'm only turning the light." She wanted to hold him, to rest her forehead against the certainty of his kindness, but the world had too many eyes. Instead, she traced the wall with her fingers, as if reading braille carved by weather. "I don't fear scandal," she whispered. "I fear regret," he answered without hesitation. Regret is loudest in rooms that look perfect in photographs. Back in Ikoyi, preparations for the engagement accelerated with mechanical efficiency. Tailors delivered garments. Florists measured doorways. A planner orchestrated seating like a battlefield disguised in silk. Gideon's family coordinated protocols. The guest list read like a ledger of influence. Adanna stood for fittings while pins kissed fabric and decisions kissed her patience. She watched herself in mirrors and searched for the pulse beneath the satin. Justice Okoro visited her dressing room unannounced, a rare softness brushing his sternness. "Everything you deserve lies ahead," he said, adjusting a cuff with too much focus. She considered the sentence, the assumption hidden in its velvet. "Everything I desire may not," she replied, and for a heartbeat, their eyes met honestly, father and daughter acknowledging a river that had never been crossed. The night before the ceremony, the city glowed like a promise made to electricity. Adanna drove herself, no convoy, no schedule, to the place that had given language to her unnamed life. The wall greeted her, ordinary and sacred. She did not ask it for answers, she let it hold her questions, the way old friends hold coats at doors. When she finally turned to leave, the wind shifted and carried a smell she loved, spice, dust, rain, thinking of returning. Chike prepared for a morning flight to Abuja for a conference he could not decline. He packed with the calm of someone who had learned to walk with unsolved equations in his chest. A text arrived from a mutual friend, confirming what the city already knew. The engagement would be televised, lightly, tastefully, inevitably. He placed the phone face down and sat by the window, the lagoon holding moonlight like a silver drum. "Witness," he reminded himself. "Tell the truth, don't beg." Dawn broke crisp, the sky rinsed clean. Staff hurried, musicians tuned, photographers tested angles against marble. A canopy rose in the garden, white on green, as though a cloud had chosen to sit. Cars lined the drive, greetings multiplied, expectations took their seats in invisible rows. Adanna stepped into her gown, each layer a story stitched by other hands. She inhaled, held, released. The day of Adanna's engagement ceremony arrived. The Okoro mansion never looked brighter. White tents stretched like sails across the manicured lawns, chandeliers dangled from imported scaffolding, and flowers cascaded in fountains of color, their scent mingling with the rich aromas of catering that promised abundance. Guests arrived in convoys of polished SUVs, their voices filling the air with laughter, speculation, and politics. The engagement ceremony was not just a union, it was a declaration of alliances, a showcase of wealth, a performance staged for Liana society. Inside the grand tent, the air shimmered with chatter. Senators clasped hands with businessmen, society women appraised gowns with competitive smiles, and cameras flashed, eager to capture the spectacle. Every detail whispered of legacy. The silk tablecloths embroidered with gold thread, the live band weaving old high-life melodies with new rhythms, the staff moving with mechanical precision. To many, It was perfection. To Adanna, it was a cage lined with velvet. When she entered, the crowd stirred. She walked with the grace she had been trained to perfect, each step poised, her gown flowing like liquid ivory, her jewelry catching the light with practiced brilliance. Yet behind her serene smile, her heart thrashed like a bird against glass. She felt every eye upon her, every expectation heavy as iron. Gideon stood waiting, immaculate in a custom agbada, his confidence polished to a sheen. He smiled at her with the assurance of a man already victorious. But Adanna's eyes wandered, past the politicians, past the businessmen, past her mother's proud, glittering gaze. And then she saw him. Chike stood quietly at the far edge of the tent, not near the front but not hidden either. He wore a simple black suit, tailored but understated, his presence calm yet undeniable. His eyes, when they met hers, did not clamor or beg. They simply waited steady, honest, unashamed. In that instant, the walls around her heart cracked. She realized with piercing clarity, happiness was not in chandeliers or headlines, not in alliances forged by signatures and handshakes. Happiness was in the simplicity of being seen, fully, without disguise. It was in the memory of chalk on a wall, of words written crooked but true. It was in the boy who had taught her that authenticity could outshine gold. The ceremony unfolded around her introductions, formalities, speeches that rolled like polished stones. Gideon spoke with the confidence of lineage, the guests nodded approvingly, and Justice Okoro watched like a commander surveying a secured battlefield. Yet Adanna's mind was elsewhere, her pulse quickening as though Liana itself urged her toward truth. When the time came for her to stand beside Gideon, she hesitated. The murmurs began immediately, too soft at first, then rippling louder. She lifted her head, eyes searching once more. Chike was still there, silent, unflinching. The choice was not abstract anymore. It was flesh, breath, and presence. Her decision came not as rebellion, but as release. She stepped away, one measured movement, then another, her gown brushing against the floor like a whisper too loud to ignore. Gasps cut through the music. Conversations froze mid-sentence. The band faltered, then stilled. The crowd parted in disbelief as Adanna walked not toward the decorated stage, not toward Gideon's assured smile, but toward Chike. Her steps were steady, her chin lifted, her will unshakable. Whispers flew like startled birds. Is she mad? What is she doing? Impossible. Gideon's expression cracked, shock flickering before pride stitched itself back into place. Justice Okoro rose halfway from his seat, his face darkening with disbelief. Adanna, he thundered, but she did not stop. Her mother's hand flew to her mouth, tears pooling at the edges of her eyes. Chike stood still, almost unable to breathe. He had not expected this, not dared to imagine it. When she reached him, she stopped just a step away, her eyes never leaving his. The silence was thick, heavy with history, but her voice cut through it, clear and unwavering. This is my choice. The words echoed, rippling through the stunned crowd, through the chandeliers, through the cameras that caught the unthinkable. And though outrage flared in some corners, though disbelief thundered in others, there was also a current of admiration, even envy. A daughter of legacy had chosen love over politics, freedom over gilded chains. Justice Okoro's face was a battlefield of fury and pride, anger and reluctant recognition. He saw his daughter not as a child rebelling, but as a woman claiming her own life. His silence, heavy as it was, became the only form of surrender he could manage. The ceremony dissolved into chaos, guests murmuring, planners scrambling, musicians frozen. But for Adanna and Chike, the noise faded. They stepped out of the tent together, into the Liana air that smelled of dust and salt and beginnings. It felt only right that their path led back to the wall. By the next evening, they stood before it again. Age had cracked it further, but someone in the neighborhood, perhaps children, perhaps anonymous admirers, had painted over it, giving it new life. Bright murals now bloomed across its surface, and in the corner, carefully preserved, were the faint traces of those first chalk words. I love you. Adanna touched the wall gently, as though greeting an old friend. Chike stood beside her, the memory of years folding into the present. They did not need speeches. The wall had always known their story, had carried their secrets, their fears, their fire. Hand in hand, they watched the children of the market run past, laughing, chalk in their own small fists, scribbling their futures into stone. The city hummed around them, restless, alive, eternal. And the wall remained weathered but standing, cracked but unbroken, an eternal witness to love that defied class, time, and expectation. The wall remains, not just of stone, but of memory, of defiance, of love, an unyielding testament to hearts that chose truth over tradition. If this story touched your heart, don't just leave quietly, show your love by liking this video. Share it with someone who believes in true love beyond barriers. And if you want more powerful Nigerian billionaire dramas like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support keeps these stories alive.